there are things that can move forward through the federal agencies. And so, Chris, I'm going to let you, introduce yourself and talk about what you do, but we're really happy to have you here today and look forward to your discussion and presentation.
Thanks so much, Melinda, and hi, everybody. I am happy to be here. And so, yeah, I'll go through a bunch of slides and talk today broadly about climate and adaptation, how policy sort of weaves in and out of that, but largely just about how people interact with climate change and forestry, and how policy, again, interweaves with them. Now, this is always the scariest moment of any talk. I'm going to start sharing my slides. And I'm going to do this. Now, let's see. All right, which one are you seeing? Is that working? All right. So as I was just kind of saying, jump right in now. It's about climate change in forests. And I was asked to talk about policy. Usually I'm asked to talk about the functionality of a policy, not about policy in general. So this was kind of interesting to think about this talk, but I tend to ground myself in practicality and people. And so I am naturally going to go to those. I was also asked to talk about myself, which is very strange. Usually people just aren't interested. I'll try this out, see how it works. So I got my bachelor's in Northern California at Humboldt State. I grew up in Monterey and California, and my PhD and my master's degree in forest science at Oregon State. And I have pictures of Humboldt and Oregon State there on top. But I included these other pictures just to emphasize that I did not see myself in this role when I was in school. And I think I have a minor in environmental ethics. I took policy classes. I thought they were the most boring thing ever. And without question, if I had free time, I wasn't thinking about policy really of any sort. I was, I don't know, playing hacky sack in the quad. I was out kayaking or rafting, and having fun. So, life takes you in strange directions. And I worked at Redwood National Park when I was at Humboldt. I worked as a soil science technician on the soil survey in the park. And when I graduated from Humboldt, the only reason I went to get a master's was because somebody at the park told me I would have a better chance of getting a job on the soil survey there if I had a master's degree. So I went ahead and did that, found out I really actually liked studying carbon cycling. Carbon biogeochemistry is down there in that primary focus list. And that's what I did for years. Went on and got a PhD and then did a couple postdocs. Worked at Lawrence Livermore, and eventually I joined the Forest Service, again, just to study carbon cycling. And it was just kind of one of those things where I got pulled into this institute, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. Back then, the focus was more on carbon. And I didn't really want to do it. I just wanted to be a scientist. And the Institute seemed to deal with a lot more outreach and education and, planning issues to some degree and policy. And really, once I started it just a bit, I got hooked because people were asking good questions, hard questions. They were people who really cared about the land that they were managing, and they were struggling with these issues of climate change. And when I was at Humboldt, I'll say that one thing that I really appreciated about that school is that it brought us out into the forest a lot. And it wasn't just the professors talking at us. They were always bringing in forest managers from other organizations, federal agencies, state agencies, industry, consultants. And so we would get a lot of different perspectives on forest management. And sometimes you'd know actually that the professor might disagree with some of those perspectives. But you'd also see this interaction between these folks being professional and respectful. And what you'd always see in all these folks is how much they cared. And you can't help but see that and say, well, all right, you can disagree, but it's when you know somebody cares genuinely and they're trying to do the right thing from their perspective, it's a lot harder to demonize. That was one of the biggest, I think, lessons I got out of all of that, and that really carried through the whole rest of my career, and has made a big difference, I think, in the way that I've approached climate change and adaptation. So let me shift gears to that a bit. One of the big things about climate is it's already here, right? We've already got climate. Climate is one of the dominant forces that affects where forests are, along with land and what forests are, and past management. And we have all kinds of threats that we've really always dealt with, whether storms or pests, disease, invasive species, wildfires, always been a thing. The thing about climate is that it's a threat multiplier. Climate change is a threat multiplier. And it brings this somewhat different threat of chronic stress, which then affects all of these other threats as well. And it's those interactions, as we're seeing in California and the West, a lot of the West right now, that really make the difference. So, in coming back to policy for a bit, we've got all kinds of programs enacted through statutes, policy-oriented or policy-created programs to address many of these threats. But policy often doesn't move fast. And so one could argue that the policies that created programs to deal with these disturbances or acute threats, aren't doing a super great job at coping with the chronic change that we're seeing. And so, one of the things we need to do is adapt. And you'll see that I use a super simple definition of adaptation here. And I say systems, I don't say ecosystems, because it's not just ecosystems, but our institutions and our policies that also need to adapt to climate change. Another key distinction that I make in the way that I talk about adaptation is that it's intentional. It's something you really need to think through. It doesn't mean you're going to change, though, what you do. It could be that what you're doing is exactly what you need to do to accommodate the risk, or you're just not allowed to do anything different, and you should just then be honest about their risks. But ideally, whatever you're doing, it's an action that will help you meet your goals and objectives. Another thing, by the way, coming out of Humboldt, I don't know how many hundreds of times I was asked, what are your management objectives? All forests are managed, even if your objective is no management, that is nonetheless management. And so, again, you've got an objective. What is it? You care about something, you value something in that system. What is it you value? Another thing is that we've been learning for decades about different ways to think about forest management. Adaptation doesn't throw these things out. It builds on them, it integrates them, and moves them forward. And then the final thing, and I just said this a bit a moment ago, anytime that you're discussing climate change with somebody, really, I think anytime, but certainly within the context of forestry, you are also having a discussion about values, and you're having a discussion about risk tolerance, because values help define perception of risk, and then risk tolerance will help define ultimately what somebody's willing or not willing to do. So to the extent that this conversation that's always under the surface isn't explicit, it's a lot easier to talk past each other. To the extent that it is explicit, it can help you understand what some differences are and just cope with those forthrightly, openly. And I think that's a good way to go forward usually. When you look across the US, and I get asked again, coming back to policy, well, what is the Forest Service policy on climate change? Well, we can have some broad policies on adapting to climate change. But people ask, well, what are you going to do? And I always think about this map, and this map shows ownership. And you can right away see some big differences in the West versus the East in terms of federal ownership. But then you see scattered throughout that family and corporate ownership, especially in the East. And it brings home that most forests are not publicly owned. And if you start getting down into the numbers, frankly, most of the activity that you see in forests in terms of timber management is not generated on federal lands. So you start looking across this map and you think about these ownership differences, and then think about the values associated with all of those different owners, whether federal or non-federal, all the different kinds of families, the TIMOs, the corporations, and then you think about that overlaid on an ecosystem, and all the different kinds of ecosystems across this map. And then climate change isn't just one thing, it's affecting places differently. So overlay that, and you get all these interactions. And then coming back to that concept of values and risk tolerance, we can make one policy, we can try, but ultimately how that plays out on the ground is really going to be filtered through people's values and their risk tolerance and their perception of risk. And when I say we, if I'm talking about the government generally or the Forest Service in particular, that's still only, not the majority of land that's out there, but we can influence a lot. And so we have to think, what are some of the best ways to influence adaptation as a positive adjustment to change. So when I was thinking how boring and stupid policy was back in the day, one connection I wished that I had made was policy in some ways is just another version of desired future condition, because I got what a desired condition was, or DFC, and that was easy enough for me to conceptualize. But policy in a lot of ways is just kind of another version of that. It's just a bigger version, more vague in some ways. But you're imagining how you want things to be, and you might imagine some objectives to help you get there, and then some actions to help you get there. And so policy is just that enacted at larger scales. And so if you think then about climate change, now climate change is going to force ecosystems, many ecosystems, into different trajectories than they have been, to the extent that their future range of climates departs from their historic range of climates. The forest is going to change, and we're already seeing that, of course. So, the question becomes, how well do our current policies cope with this reality? It's still a big question. I don't have the answer for you. I'm sorry. Adaptation options. One of the big ways to deal with this, again, staying kind of high level here, is to think about these options of adaptation. And I think these are also just helpful ways to think about forest management and change in general. And I'll try to weave, again, this policy idea through here. That idea that your actions should be robust across a range of potential future conditions, that's just a good starting point, whether you're dealing with climate change or not, but it's especially important when you are dealing with climate change. So I'm going to dig into each one of these just a little bit. In resistance, as an approach to forest management and climate change adaptation, you are essentially trying to stop change. You're trying to keep that system as it is. When we talk about a high value system, that can be economic value, but it could be a cultural value as well. And so, any kind of value, again, people place different values in ecosystems and act accordingly. And so some systems, they are brittle ecologically, and with change associated with climate, they can move to a different state. They're not resilient. They can change, and we want them to stay the same. We might want them to stay the same because there's an endangered species, because there is culturally important kind of tree or animal there, whatever. So we invest basically in keeping that system the same. And to come back to this idea of desired future condition, the DFC is basically the same in the future as it is now. That's what we want. And we're worried here about how much climate might pressure the system to be different. Now, to the extent that climate pressures it to be really different, the reality is that we're going to have to invest more resources to keep it the same. And over time, we're going to also take on more risk that system is going to maybe fail altogether, but certainly that our investment is going to be lost and we'll lose the values, the qualities that we most value in that system. We might be mandated to take that risk. One of the reasons I use the word climate informed, we can make a climate informed decision to continue that investment, take the risk, knowing in all likelihood it will fail. Ideally, we're just being honest and transparent about the risk that we're taking. And so when a lot of the time I default to government thinking here. If you're working with a private landowner, they may want that system to stay just the same as it is because they grew up there and they want it to be the same for their children. You can, as you help them, talk about steps they can take to keep it the same in spite of climate change. And just be honest about both the cost and the risk. So there's not a right or wrong decision here when we're talking about these things, just as there's in climate change, just as there's not now without discussions of climate change. It's just a matter of having that clear and informed discussion. Resilience, a lot of the time, is kind of this default mode for most of us in natural resources. And I tend to use I do absolutely use the definition from Halling in 1973. And so ideally, if a system is resilient, it can take a hit of some kind. And while it might, bounce around a little bit, it's going to come back to some set of conditions that you define as the good conditions for that forest. Or it's, the way the forest is as you've defined the forest. And so there's lots of things that you can do to help that system take that hit and come back, absorb disturbance and return to its natural functional state. And coming back to this, so you have this desired future condition where, maybe different than a system that you want to keep just the same, you're willing to accommodate more change through time, as long as you get back to something more or less within this range of characteristics that you've value in this system. But essentially, you're dealing with the same dynamic, that to the extent that climate is going to push this system further from its historic climate or regime, you're taking on more risk and you're going to need to invest more resources in it. So most of our policies, they accommodate resistance and resilience. And they have a little bit more difficult of a time accommodating this concept of transition. And in a system in which you are willing to transition it to something different because you know that it is vulnerable, it's gonna fail with climate change no matter what. Maybe it's already failed and you can't get it to come back. It was not resilient, got hit by a disturbance, and it's not coming back to the way it was. Maybe, in fact, this transition is a restoration of an existing forest to something it was in the past, and you think what it was in the past, in fact, will be better for the future, like maple to oak savanna, or Douglas fir to pine. So, you might want to push the system in that direction, and you think it will be helpful. But in some cases, the policies that you're working under, whether it's what you're allowed to do, given statute and planning guidance or other guidance in the federal government, or are incentivized to do given government incentives on private land, or as a consulting forester what your landowner, your client might want to do, you just might not be able to go in this direction. So as we think about this, the idea here is that in the near term, you may take on a little bit more risk as you begin to, and need a little bit more investment as you begin to transition the system. And that's often where you get the resistance, whether social or policy, monetary, capacity oriented, even though in the long term, the system is ideally adjusted better to the projected range of climates that you're going to get in the future. So you might then in the future have less risk. But that's just frankly a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, both the near term and the near term risk and the long term change. So you've heard me bring up risk a lot and change a lot. And you look at these three sort of really broad approaches here to climate change adaptation. And resistance and resilience are really about persistence. You really don't want the system to change either at all or a lot in those two approaches to climate. Transition is really all about change. The system maybe is going to change anyway and you want to help it. So most of our policy tends to be grounded in those first two, resistance and resilience, and often doesn't deal super well with transition. And even when it is a forward-thinking policy that would like us to plan for climate change, it nonetheless doesn't give us the freedom to make changes to accommodate climate change. Now, a lot of policy is based in law, but one of the things that can happen when you get, well, can happen anytime with an administration, but tends to happen especially when an administration, presidential administration is relatively new, is they'll put out executive orders. And that can create very abrupt shifts in policy. So we've got this one, you may have heard of it, Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. This was released January of 21. It has dominated my life for the last year for certain. It was a big and complex executive order, and it generated a ton of reports and activities. Many of those reports, like the ag and forestry strategy, set strategy for whole agencies or even government-wide to deal with climate change. But mind you, in these executive orders, as sweeping as they may be, in the end, you're always going to find some text that says, oh, and by the way, these work within existing laws and statutes. So you can't just go ahead and change laws with these executive orders. So they still have to work within those broader bounds that laws have set for policy. So some of the activities that are going on in the Forest Service to deal with climate change and are consistent with that executive order that I just mentioned are that we're trying to, we're investing into research that can help generate new products that can help create or bolster markets, say for like small diameter trees where the markets aren't super strong, but would make, say, an enormous difference in places like Colorado, but well, everywhere. But in some places where you don't have a super strong industry, they would make much more of an apparent difference. And then you've got changes in forest planning and decision making. For forest as a national forest, forest-wide, site-specific decision making, often in combination with NEPA, so National Environmental Policy Act, again, a law that creates all kinds of policy direction for federal agencies. And then our post-fire responses and the reforestation that goes, also informed by and influenced by laws and funding, and especially in this EO, a big one was equity and environmental justice assessment and action. The EO really asked us to, in the Forest Service, to consider our investments into things like fire preparedness, firefighting, general community response, and investment in fuel reduction treatments, and how those are distributed and whether they adjust or change historic patterns of investment in disadvantaged communities. And so we're active in trying to figure a lot of that out. Another big piece here is hazardous fuels treatments for wildfire risk reduction. I think I have a couple slides on that. So wildfire. So these things are all happening. They're all interacting with policy one level or another. They're all being, on the last slide, they're all being pushed by that executive order, but still bound in many ways by policies, laws that were created literally 50, 60, 75 years ago. And so, in some cases, there's only so much you can do, but in other cases, find that gray area and work within it. With wildfire, we've been in a situation where it's just been getting worse and worse. And as we know, it's not, and that is related to climate change for certain, but not all about climate change. It would have gotten worse no matter what. And at this point, it's largely outstripped our ability to deal with it with the funding and structures to use that funding that we previously had. At one point, the Forest Service was, I think, spending 15%, 25, 30 years ago, 15% of its budget on firefighting preparedness. Now it's more like 60%. And we were losing ground every year, frankly. And so, we created a strategy to deal with this. It's consistent with that executive order and the strategy that it created. And then Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which added $3 billion to our ability to do fuels reduction. That amount is enormous and transformative. For reference, the full Forest Service budget is around $5.5 billion in any given year. So $3 billion over several years. And the goal here is to increase our pace and scale of fuels reduction by up to 4 times, at least in the West. And that kind of activity, of increase in activity, is genuinely transformative. And honestly, we're just trying to figure out how we're going to do it. We've been in starvation mode for decades, and now Congress has said, great, we see you, we understand, we've just put Thanksgiving dinner on the table for you now. It's overflowing, but by the way, you gotta finish this in an hour. And so we are trying to figure out how we're going to do that. An enormous component of how we're going to do that is not alone, is with our partners. Now, coming back to climate change, I talked about this threat multiplier and their interactions. And I talked about this idea of resistance and resilience and transition. This thing that we've been doing for decades of just outright fire suppression, that is effectively a resistance strategy. What we've seen is that it has required, in fact, more and more investment to maintain. Our risk has been increasing, and we are now, some would argue, actively failing. And so what we're looking at with this wildfire strategy is, how do we move from resistance and increase resilience to fire, especially in fire-prone and adapted systems, replace them into more of a natural state of fire resilience, but also start looking at that gray area of moving into transition to the extent we can, and help these systems adapt to what are essentially new fire regimes and a longer or nonstop fire season with more severe fires and what we would call uncharacteristic fires. So again, this is a key part of what we're doing with climate now as we think this through. For those of you who are students, This is going to be a big part of your careers. This is going to be something that you hear about more and more, and the investment that is going into it now is kind of those once in a generation investments. And so it's neat that it's happening as you enter the system. So just for some thoughts, final thoughts here. Couple key ones here is that I've kind of tried to weave policy in through this talk. And I've talked in various ways about how it can restrict your choices, but fundamentally it can't restrict your creativity. There is always gray area for you to work in. And you'll find that the more you interact with policy, the better you'll get at working in that gray area. When I was in school and I thought policy was stupid and boring and really didn't affect much, I hadn't yet tried to get stuff done on the ground. And once I started trying to get stuff done on the ground where I wanted to work, what I found again and again is I was told, no, you can't do that because XYZ policy. As I started learning more about the policy, I started finding gray areas where I could say, actually, R is the case, not X, Y, or Z, and we can do this. And now that I'm in this role where I can actually inform policy creation and guidance, I'm trying to learn from all of that and think about people and their values and that map that I first showed you and say, how can we create rules, guidance, even policy that is as flexible as it can be while giving people choices and opportunity. And that comes to that second point. You can create opportunity for people. It doesn't mean that they're going to take it. It doesn't mean that they will want to do anything differently than they've ever done in the past. And for those of you who want to be super creative, that will just be a source of frustration in your careers. And that's just an unfortunate reality. But also it means that, you know, you can work on communication. So I come back to this idea of climate informed choices. They just aren't going to always be ideal given what people want. But if you listen carefully to them and you listen to their values and understand what they perceive of as risk, you can find different ways to talk to them about their choices and their opportunities. And what it requires is for you to be more creative in that point. And I'll say that on that final point of creativity, that your generation is really going to be required to be more creative probably than any other forestry generation in the past, given the pace and scale of change that we're seeing. And so, you know, again, look at those first three bullets, and that's good and bad, exciting and daunting. Finally, is that last point, getting back to values. People make decisions based on their values, and they will use climate as a justification or as a, you know, a threat. But usually it's just about their values, and climate just weaves into that. So think about those first 3 points again. And when you're talking to people about choices and about climate, remember you're really talking to them about their values. And as you're helping them with decisions, whether they're on federal lands or private lands, in whatever capacity you end up working in, remember what you're really talking about and how important it is to listen and then, you know, work creatively in the space that you're given. And that's what I've got for you today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. That was a really great presentation. Ton of valuable information for these students that are going to be pursuing careers in forestry or other natural resources, whether that's in the public or private sector, and whether they're going to be focusing specifically on policy or, you know, more on the management side. This is all really important, as it's pretty easy to see climate is a really far-reaching topic into just about any profession, natural resource profession that these students will be going into. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. So I just wanted to take a little second to introduce myself and tell y'all a little bit about how we're going to proceed with the Q&A portion of the meeting. So first things first, if everybody could turn back on your cameras so we can see your bright shining faces. Awesome. Thank you. I see familiar faces and new people, so it's good to see y'all. Happy to have y'all with us. So my name is Katie Moss. I'm the Government Affairs Coordinator for the Forest Landowners Association. I'm also a Mississippi State graduate, class of 2018. So I was in a lot of y'all's shoes not too long ago, and we're really happy to have y'all here. So if you do have any questions for Dr. Swanston, if you could please use the raise hand function, and we'll call on you and ask you to unmute. You can also put any questions you have in the chat. We're happy to answer those, and we'll get to those after we go through all of the hands. So with that, I would like to kick off the Q&A session with a fun question while everybody is thinking about their more serious questions. So I saw on your first slide that you are a mug collector. So from one mug collector to another, what is your favorite mug and how long have you had it?
Oh, that's so different. That is a different question and a difficult one. I had, not since COVID, but prior to that, I would travel a lot, and wherever I would go, I would try to pick up a mug. I have hundreds. I have sub collections of mugs, whether they're natural history museums or parks or national forests or just different cities around the world. And I use all of them. It's not stamp collection, right? Not like just wasted space. What can you do with a stamp collection? You can't like lick it and actually get something out of it. A mug you can use, but okay. Let's see. I'm going to have to call this one my favorite. So this, oh wait, here we go. This is a mug. It says NIAX and it has our logo on it. It has in Latin on the back, Adepto Stercor, I can't say this, Sphere. Our motto, which is get stuff done, except stuff isn't the actual word that we tend to use in the Institute. And that was given to me by my folks that was my 10-year anniversary as the director of the Institute. And that's still my favorite mug, has huge sentimental value to me. And especially now that I'm in this job with the pressures and the people that I deal with some days, I just use this mug. It gives me a warm feeling. Thanks, Katie. I love that question.
Of course. Any other questions? Oh, I see Megan has her hand raised. If you want to ask your question.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, first off, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great. And I have to commend you for including that photo of the Kirtland's warbler. I do a lot of my research in KW management areas, so that was exciting to see. I have a little bit of experience with some partners from the Forest Service, and I was just curious about the approval process. So if you have a new policy that you want to implement on the landscape, how long does it really take to see that change?
Virtually any answer to your question, Megan, is going to involve the word years. And there's a couple of different levels there. And so, you know, one is the thing that you want to do on the landscape, is it within existing policy that's in our handbook, all of which is based upon different authorities, laws, statutes that govern us. If it is, then it's got to generally, if it's a vegetation management or is going to affect wildlife, it's going to have to be in some way covered by a NEPA analysis and decision. In the Forest Service, they can go fast, which is less, like crazy fast, which is less than a year, but in generally they take 2 to 3 years. And if it's vegetation management, maybe you're wanting to remove trees and return a system to an early seral stage to better support some wildlife. That can take also then another few years to do a timber sale and get some foresters out there to do the work on the ground. I'll say that there are adaptation planning exercises we've done with units, national forests, where they still haven't done the work on the ground. They've did the work for the planning, and 5 years later, it still isn't done. Where sometimes we'll work with a private landowner or a company or even a conservancy, and it can happen same year. So it's a pretty big difference. Did that get to your question?
Yes, it did. Just from my experience, we have both state and federal partners for our research, and it takes a lot longer to do work on federal lands versus state land, which is where we do most of our work. So I was just curious about that. But yeah, thank you so much. That really helped.
Sure.
I see Gregory has his hand raised. You can go ahead with your question.
Hi, Dr. Swanston. Thanks for your time today. I was wondering if you've seen any correlation with the amount of risk that people are willing to tolerate and their perceptions of the baseline that's shifting as well. Is there like any kind of correlation with people's tolerance to risk generationally, perhaps?
That's a really good question. Boy, I don't know how to answer that. I feel like there's a couple different levels to that. It's interesting generationally, especially in northern latitudes where the change is happening faster. You're seeing some of the old codgers who will say, I don't believe in that climate change, but things are, I can't get recruitment any longer. Or I've got top kill all over the place, or I don't get the snowpack I used to get that I harvest on top of, and so now I can't do operations for a huge part of the year where I used to. And so don't know if I believe you about climate change, but let's talk about adaptation as just a practical solution to some of these problems. And so with some people who have a longer personal experience with places, they see the change and it's changing their mind. And with folks who are newer in their career, they're generally, I think, more open to these ideas, a lot of these ideas, and they learned about climate in school, climate change in school, and have maybe even in forestry school started talking about adaptation. A lot of the people, though, who are kind of that mid-career level didn't get adaptation in school, haven't been attached to the land as long. And for them, it's a much steeper climb, I feel like, to break into this.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All righty, anybody else? So while we're waiting for maybe some more questions, I have a question. So what advice would you give to some of these students that are looking to pursue a career, maybe at the USDA or in some, the forestry or natural resources field as it relates to climate or carbon or something like that?
I think that, I guess, you have a range of folks here who write undergrad and grad, or is everybody graduate student? Undergrad and grad. I guess once you get in, there's all kinds of different career paths you can go. So don't ever think you're boxed into one thing. Always be aggressive about taking care of your own career and advancing your own interests. And so you might come into a job as a forester, but you might be interested in climate change. Just keep asking your boss what you can do, and ask for, in the federal government, in the Forest Service, we do these things called details, where you can do another job for a couple months or 4 months, and take on that position description, and get a whole new suite of experiences. And then it goes into your sort of federal record. And so at some point, if you want to then apply for a job with those skills, the HR person who's overseeing all that can see that you've done this work. So first of all, I would say just don't ever feel you're boxed in. Always know that you've got choices and be willing to change things up and take them. If you're thinking before you get in that you want to pursue that kind of work, the Forest Service, it has different branches in it. One of them is a research branch. And so you might think about being a researcher if you want to go down an academic route, but don't want to work in a university. And then we've got, of course, the National Forest System, which is the system that oversees our national forests and has the most people in it. And there's just a gazillion different kinds of jobs. So pretty much whatever you want to do in forestry, you can find that in that job. You can find that job in that system. So I would say, if you have a sense of what that is now, just start preparing for it and start looking up on USA Jobs what the skills and attributes that are required for that job are. Start taking those classes, doing those summer jobs and internships to get that experience. And then finally, start talking to people. Look up, if there's a certain kind of job you're interested in, find somebody who does that job, and reach out to them and ask for a meeting. Maybe you can go hang out on their forest and spend a couple days with them. Maybe you can do a summer internship or job with them. But people like it when folks ask them about what they do. Makes them feel good, like what they do matters, right? So you'll get, if you ask them about what they do, they'll be happy to tell you, and you can begin building relationships, because in the end, a lot of getting a job and moving forward in an agency or an organization is just about the relationships that you build. So always, think about that. It comes down to people, and not just what you know, but who.
I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got from one of my mentors, as I was going through trying to, find my ideal career, was you're the best, where you're going to succeed in your job is going to be where your passions intersect with what you're good at. So just, as you're going through your classes and you're finding that you're excelling maybe in certain classes, and it's also something that you're really passionate about, there might be something there. So yeah, I completely agree. You can always find something that's right up the alley of what you're wanting to do.
Yep, and don't be trapped. So if that changes through time, change with it, roll with it, change it up, get another job. You're not trapped. Like I said, I thought I was going to be doing, soil survey into my old age, just digging pits, getting grubby in the dirt, being happy about it. And here I am doing something completely different, and really loving what I do in general.
I think I saw Raymond's hand go up, and then Brianna after that.
Hello, Dr. Swanston. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. I'm a graduate student here at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, nestled within the Shawnee National Forest. And I've studied the management that goes on in the National Forest pretty extensively. And it seems to me that there's somewhat of a lag between the management that's occurring on the ground and the climate adaptive silviculture that I've seen research on. Just for instance, like some of the forest management here mostly focuses around shelter wood systems. And I just wanted to see if you had any recommendations towards, you know, encouraging the Forest Service on the National Forest System towards, you know, more of these climate adaptive silvicultural practices.
Sure, I would say that there is absolutely a lag. And some of that is, you know, what I was, you know, first discussing a bit with that first question. I think that was Megan's question, which is it can take years. It's not uncommon. 5 years is absolutely not uncommon, but 10 years is not unusual. To get a project all the way through all of the various sort of planning hoops that it will need to go through before it can actually get done on the ground. So oftentimes what you see implemented might reflect thinking that was done years ago and might not be completely current. And so that doesn't mean that what they're planning now isn't exactly in line with what you would love to talk to them about. And so I will come back to what I said just a moment ago, which is find out who a civilculturalist is, and reach out to that person and have a discussion about what they do and what they're thinking. And if you have neat silvicultural examples that you think would work well on the Shawnee, talk to them about it. And, you know, just remember, they may disagree with you, you may disagree with them, but they care. Like, you can disagree, but both still care. And there's something in the chat there about forests being complex. They are really complex, and there is often multiple right answers. And we have to remind ourselves of that a lot.
Thank
I
you
think
so
I
much.
got to your whole question, Raymond. Did I?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the recommendation. I appreciate it.
You betcha.
All right, Brianna, want to make sure I'm saying it right.
Brianna. I have two quick questions. The first one is kind of from an ecophysiological approach. So plants are often able to adapt to the changes in the climate in terms of their water use efficiency will improve with increasing carbon dioxide levels, and then also just the ability to shift their optimum temperatures for photosynthesis. So knowing that the forest system in itself is resilient within the plant species, what do you think is one of the largest concerns in terms of forest management moving forward with climate change, if the forests themselves are to an extent stable?
My biggest concern is that the forests aren't stable enough. Is that climate change will, you know, like those graphs I showed you, in many places, push chronically well outside of the historic range of climate that helped shape those forests. And so I think that you're absolutely right, that there is that a lot of plants have a great ability to adapt. Certainly increased CO2 does increase the water use efficiency of a lot of plants, but there's a point at which they still fail. And so if I never get to talk about vapor pressure deficits, so I'm so happy, Brianna, that you gave me the opportunity. One of the things that we're getting with climate change is it's getting hotter, and so when it's hotter, the air can hold more moisture, but it also demands more moisture. And it's also been getting at least annually wetter, but that moisture is delivered differently throughout the year than it used to be. And so we've been in a sweet spot, really. CO2 really is plant food. Plants have been growing faster with more CO2. Many plants have had increased water use efficiency. So they've been growing faster, bigger. And in areas where you have especially enough like nitrogen, hell, it's just been the greatest time ever. And so what's beginning to happen now is the temperature is increasing past this point where the vapor pressure deficit, which is how much water the air can hold versus how much it's got in it, is high enough that plants are shutting down more. And so they're not able to, they lose too much water and they're not able to then photosynthesize. And that's causing loss in productivity, loss in growth, decrease in health. And so just seeing that now, but projections are that certainly in the West, it's going to get a lot worse. So the question is, you know, how much change will that drive and how can we interact with that change to minimize negative effects?
And then, well, part of that, in terms of a solution, would you think that that's just more of introducing different species onto different sites, which goes back to kind of what you were saying on values and what people value, and if they're particular to their one specific species on a specific site, I can see how that would be harder to implement. But and then my other question was, you had mentioned the executive orders that were being passed, and just from like a job standpoint, how difficult is it to make progress in terms of policies when you have radically different changes within presidencies in terms of the executive orders and their views of the environment as a whole?
I've been working in climate change now in 4 different administrations, and some of them are really different, have been really different than others. And they've all put out executive orders, and they've all promulgated different policies. Thus, my comments about working in that gray area and about how it can certainly, policy can restrict your choices. And it just forces you to be that much more creative. And likewise, when you get a cornucopia like that 14008 executive order, you know, tackling the climate crisis, all kinds of opportunity, but you know that brings other sorts of challenges, and so you have to help people with that opportunity, and it still takes effort to push things forward. It just always does. People are people. They got values. They hate change.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers.
Thank you.
And we're a little bit past time, but we have 2 more questions in the chat. I don't know if you have time, or you know,
Sure.
You're a busy person. We understand if you got to go, but I think that you sort of you answered, I think, a lot of what that first question in the chat is asking about. What advice would you give to young foresters who may struggle with making management recommendations with confidence because of the complexity of forests? But I don't know if you had anything to add.
Well, I guess what I say, maybe, I don't mean this to be totally flippant, but just expect failure. You know, because it's going to happen, and especially with climate change, it just adds complexity, and so just constantly be learning. You can't, you know, we don't have perfect control over what an ecosystem does. You know, we come in, we do management, we make an intervention, we think we know what's going to happen, what the balances are, what we've tweaked, and what direction it's going to go. And nature just always has the bigger voice in that, whether it's a storm that comes through, or a pest epidemic, or a fire, you know, or you didn't realize that in storms, you know, the wind that comes from a different direction, and you put your shelter wood with the wrong, you know, densities. And so you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to learn through time, and that's okay. And I think that a big part, I often have a communication bullet in my concluding thoughts. I didn't do that this time, but one thing to do is to clearly communicate not just confidence, but variability. I mean, be transparent about the risks and the potential for the management that you're doing to go in different directions than intended. Because that's just the reality in forest management. And anybody you talk to who's been doing this for 40 years, I haven't. Any of the old codgers you talk to, they've all got horror stories. And so it's a part of the job. And that kind of got back to that bit of your generation, I think, is really going to have to draw upon creativity more than any of us ever have in the past, because you're going to enter your jobs in this time of an increasing rate of change in climate. And to get to Brianna's question, that's going to be affecting forests in some places really differently than in other places. So everybody's going to have to be learning faster and sharing that learning with each other more quickly. I'll stop there. I can just go on and on answering these. So does it look bad to move around within forestry employment system too quickly? Do you need to keep a job a certain amount of time? Gosh, I was just having this discussion with somebody. It depends on the job, really. I don't think it looks bad. In the Forest Service, people move around in jobs a lot. I mentioned details. That's considered a really positive thing because you get different experiences. And I also mentioned relationships. If you move around a lot and you have positive relationships with the people and the places you worked, you can get great letters of recommendation. And those really do make a difference. As you go up in GS levels, then there is value in putting in time in a certain kind of specialty, because you just get better at it, and people see that and they see that you stick it through, and then you'll find that you have a depth of perspective that makes you more competitive. And even if you want to change specialty, people will see that you have the ability to really dig into something and speak with expertise on it. And so you might say, well, okay, now I'm changing subjects, but I learned this last one, I can learn this new one. So fundamentally, certainly at the beginning of your career, it's not bad to move around a lot. And in some agencies like the Forest Service, you're in fact expected to move jobs quite a bit, especially in early years.
Well, Chris, thank you. And you got a lot of great questions asked, and you did a good job answering them, and Katie as well. So thank you, everyone. And we hope you got a lot out of the 3 sessions, the Virtual Forest Policy Institute. Like I said, stay tuned, connect with us, sign up for our Focus newsletter. We will be having the Public Policy Institute in person next year in Washington, D.C. And we're always here as a resource for you too, as you make your journey through college and into careers. So look for the email coming out with the survey about these different sessions. And again, we want to send you off with the Starbucks gift card to help you through your studies. So Chris, thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and for the past 2 days. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, folks.